I have 6 o'clock, so at this time, I would like to call the school board meeting for Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020 for the Des Moines Public Schools to order. Ms. Jenkins, please take the roll.
Mr. Barron,
Here.
Ms. Bradley,
Here.
Ms. Caldwell Johnson, Mr. Cody,
Here.
Ms. Delagardelle,
Here.
Ms. Martirano,
Here.
Ms. Sawyer.
Here.
The first item of business this evening is approval of the agenda. May I have a motion and a second to approve our agenda?
Sawyer, so moved.
Second.
Martirano, second.
I have a motion by Sawyer and a second by Barron. Please call the vote.
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Ms. Delagardelle,
Yes.
Ms. Martirano,
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
The vote is approved 6-0. The next item on our agenda is approval of our minutes for Tuesday, October 20th. May I have a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
So moved, Martirano.
Second, Cody.
We have a motion by Martirano and a second by Cody. Please call the vote.
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Ms. Delagardelle,
Yes.
Ms. Martirano,
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
The next item on our agenda is the consent items. We allow any person or persons the opportunity to speak to the board for up to 5 minutes following the presentation of an agenda item. If anyone wishes to speak to an agenda item, please make sure you contact Ms. Jenkins to sign up. Remarks must be germane to the agenda, and we ask that you avoid reference to personalities and character attacks, as those types of comments serve no productive purpose. We appreciate your input. As a reminder to both the board and public, the board will not engage in discussion or deliberation with the speaker regarding comments made to agenda items. Discussion and deliberation will remain among board members at the board table, with speakers' comments informing said discussion, deliberation, and determinations as deemed necessary. Mr. Cody, I believe you have the motion this evening.
I do. I move that the board approve the consent items in accordance with the recommended action for each item on the consent agenda, including bills previously authorized, certified, and approved for payment by the board secretary in the amount of $6,637,254.14.
Is there a second?
Sawyer, second.
All right. Ms. Jenkins, do we have any speakers on this item this evening?
No, we do not.
Okay, we have a motion by Cody and a second by, I believe, Sawyer. Do we have any questions or discussion on behalf of the board? All right, hearing no discussion or questions, Ms. Jenkins, can you please call the vote?
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Ms. Bradley,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Ms. Delagardelle,
Yes.
Ms. Martirano,
Yes.
Ms. Sawyer.
Yes.
All right, motion passes 6-0. The next item on our agenda is item D1, our legislative priorities. This is a discussion item, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ahart to bring this before the board.
Thank you. The legislative priorities that I'm proposing, number 4, the first 3 being identical to what was proposed last year. If you recall, last year we worked on those first 3 and actually had some very promising initial conversations about the funding, foundation funding formula, and a study committee was actually in the process of being created. The 4-year-old preschool was a little tougher go, and we actually made some really good headway on the ELL issue. Unfortunately, the legislative session was cut short due to the pandemic, and it was suspended from about the middle of March until they came back in June for a week, and most of the legislative agenda that had been suspended was abandoned for them to tackle finalizing the budget and a few other details, including Senate File 2310. So after consulting with Christopher Rance and John Cacciatore, our lobbyists, we felt like those three were certainly ready for us to continue those conversations. And then I added rather, a last item. The UEN is considering a similar initiative, as is the School Administrators of Iowa and Iowa Association of School Boards. Enrollment loss is a challenge that we're facing, but it's certainly not unique to our district. In fact, nationwide, it's a huge issue because of the pandemic. And what we could get from the state in terms of a budget guarantee, which we discussed in our work session on budget last meeting, does provide additional spending authority, but it does not provide the funding to go with it, and would leave us and many other districts, quite frankly, in a bit of a compromised position, especially if we're able to get a lot of those students back for next fall and actually have reduced funding for a greater number of students. So I don't know exactly what the right approach will be with that. We're talking with legislators now and trying to figure out what would be the most appropriate strategic approach to address that. But I wanted to make sure we had that included here, so when that takes more of a fuller shape, that we've already had approval of that by our board, so we can move forward with it. And so what I'm asking for is a discussion on this, and then we would bring this item for approval at our next meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. Board colleagues, any questions or discussion?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So Tom, like in addition to adding number 4, we took off a I always say the old way of saying it, but the allowable growth funding has been on there in the past, correct?
We had that as sort of a preamble, last year.
Is it, based on talking to Chris and John, is it fair to say then that really everyone's going to be more geared up for some sort of a fix, because of drops in enrollment, than necessarily securing that's almost the new funding formula for the year?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, Rob. How we talked about allowable growth, and that's certainly an important discussion. Supplemental state aid. You got me saying the old language too. So I think that item number 4 is something that we roll the supplemental state aid into. So it's not just a supplemental state aid piece, but it's also recognizing that there's enrollment loss due to COVID-19, but it's beyond that as well. There are also a whole host of other expenses that districts have had to take on, especially Des Moines. And we really have not had, aside from the CARES Act, which didn't even cover all the expenses that we had from COVID for FY20. We've not received any additional funding to address COVID challenges for FY21. Of course, there's some discussion about something coming from the federal level. And, we hope that will be the case. We don't know what strings will be attached to that. And depending on how things turn out tonight and the aftermath of tonight, we'll probably know, hopefully, quite a bit more prior to having to go forward with certifying our budget. And probably we'll know something pretty definitively before the state budget gets passed, but we certainly want to make sure that whole issue is part of the deliberations.
So for in a working sense, then really what 4 is not necessarily just a funding fix, but also a fair supplemental state aid for the year. And if we were to talk on it, and obviously we're months away from that, then it'd really be two points or a couple sub points out of that one.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll have that a little bit better defined here in, within a month or so, when we've had more time to collaborate with our other partners on this issue and had more of a chance to vet it with whomever our legislators end up being after the election.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, you bet.
Tom, I think you had mentioned the first three. You had talked to John, and I think it's Christopher. Isn't, for some reason, I just haven't interacted with him quite as much, so I sometimes forget his name. But you said you'd interacted with them around the first three, but not the. Have you had a chance to talk to them about the fourth one, or what's kind of their take?
we talked about the fourth one as well. Yeah.
Okay. And you had said there were some other organizations that might be looking at that one as well. I just wanted to clarify that. So
yeah, the UEN is for sure. The SAI is talking about it, as is IASB.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or discussion from board colleagues? Okay, so I believe what our past process has been is that this would appear on consent, I believe, at our next meeting.
Correct.
Okay. Well, without any further questions or discussions, and that's a discussion only item, I feel comfortable moving us on to agenda item D2, our management limitation 2.11 report. And this is a discussion and action item, but I will turn it over to Dr. Ahart for the presentation.
Yeah, so this looks similar to what you've seen in the past. We don't have new academic data, but that will be a part of our report on the 17th. This focuses on those first metrics regarding student supports, attendance, participation rates, et cetera. We have it broken down, though, in more detail by the different demographic groups, as well as by splitting it out between in-person and virtual. Since we now have pre-K through middle school, about 60% of those students attending at least half their days in person. What you'll note is, attendance is lower than normal by a bit, but the variance between the various groups does not have a huge range of difference. You can note that, for instance, the elementary attendance and participation, there's just not a huge variance by the different groups. If you follow down, for instance, in-person days, all student numbers 87.7, and it gets as high as 90.6 for the white subgroup and as low as 80.8 for special education. And that's about as big of a span as you'll see in the different attendance ranges. High school, of course, is still virtual, so that participation is measured how we were measuring it before, by interactions, confirmed interactions as teachers take attendance every day. They actually finalize their attendance the following day to give them a little bit more time. So not a whole lot of new news here, but a bit more information as we've broken it down by the various demographic populations.
So, board, the action that we'll take related to this item is to accept these, because these aren't being, I don't think, classified as far as from our superintendent as being compliant, non-compliant, or partially compliant. This is just an update to those metrics. So we're just accepting that we've received this update, essentially, as the action we take this evening. Before we move into discussion, may I have a motion and a second to approve the acceptance of item D2 Management Limitation 2.11 report?
Martorano, so moved.
Bradley, second.
All right, we have a motion by Martorano and a second by Bradley. What discussion or questions do my board colleagues have this evening?
Do we have speakers on this?
Not this one, no, the next one.
No.
It's the next one, okay.
I'm sorry, I did forget to ask that. Thank you, Mr. Barron.
I forgot which one we had speakers on, so.
Yeah, it's the next one, so. Unless we've had anyone email Ms. Jenkins in the last few minutes, so.
I'm curious about the student supports. The average number of communications outside of instructional time per student. What does that typically look like at the building level? Is that building leadership, counselors? What, can you give us some insight into those numbers?
That it's not typically, it could be administrator, but typically it's going to be the biggest group would be teachers. So, reaching out to a student or the student's family, maybe outside of the regular school day. And that can happen either by appointment or just by a teacher, reaching out of concern or because there was an unanticipated absence, etc. Sometimes it's a follow-up conversation from someone else, a social worker, a counselor, etc., based on a conversation that a teacher has had or potentially an administrator. So it kind of takes the range, but the bulk of them would be teacher to student contact.
And that's any type of communication, whether it be a phone call, an email, a text message.
Correct.
Chat. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Tom, I know it's really early. I mean, we've only had elementary back for 2 weeks and middle school not even back quite a full week because the Thursday, Friday cohort only had 1 day last week.
Right.
But looking at like those virtual days, and like I'm going to go to the elementary report, and you look at just participation, or I will say attendance/participation, less than 60% for special ed. They're in the 60 range, up to 74.7 for our white students. What are some plans to address students in that virtual space to make sure we're connecting with them? And I know that I had asked you the definitions of attendance versus participation. And you said there are a number of things that could count for that. And you even said office hour meeting. So I assume that would take or could mean if a student just spoke to a teacher, that's considered participation/attendance. So can you talk a little bit about what the plans are going to be to make sure that we are connecting with our students in that virtual space?
Yeah, that's actually the biggest challenge, and that's the biggest problem with the hybrid, especially at elementary and middle school in particular. We'll see what it looks like when we have the high school started, but if you'll note, and let's just stick on that elementary page if people are there, if you look at the 100% virtual versus the virtual portion of the hybrid students, there's a pretty significant difference there. So that's something that we're actively looking at and attempting to problem solve. It becomes the virtual days for the hybrid students look considerably different than the days that they had when we were in fully virtual. And so trying to find that rhythm and figuring out how that's going to work with each family and how to best, coordinate that on a student by student basis is really where I think where the solution is. And so some of that is a matter of time, and some of it, some of that is bringing in some additional resources, especially for most likely for our ELL and special education students, figuring out how do we better coordinate the additional supports that they get on their virtual days, so that we're not inadvertently causing a disconnect because the rhythm is off for what their days had been like in all virtual. So that's not a real clean answer, but we're just starting to get the data, collected and seeing what that looks like. So that's one of our problem solving challenges.
Can you define for me then, because when we started, everybody was virtual. So we all had synchronous learning with our teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have a portion of kids, 60-some% that are hybrid and 40-some% roughly that are virtual.
Right.
So those kids that are now virtual, it's no longer synchronous learning with teachers anymore, correct?
Well, no, a lot of it is synchronous, but not for the hybrid students. It's the hybrid students who are on their virtual days is more asynchronous than synchronous than it had been when they were in fully virtual.
I think that depends on the school too, and I think that's where some
there is variance. There is variance between schools because
there's not consistency across the district.
No, there's not.
Okay, because I know my child who's in middle school has synchronous learning on her virtual days, and so she stayed with her cohort. But that's not what I'm hearing from a parent in an elementary school, that it's now asynchronous, which was never what they expected. That's not what they were told, but it sounded like the building maybe could have done it that way, but chose not to. And so I'm not sure why there's such a disconnect and why there's such a difference with that. And maybe you can help us understand a little bit how those decisions were made, and were they made at a building level? Why?
Well, it largely has to do with the breakdown of how many students in a particular building were registered to stay fully virtual, and how many registered to stay or to move to hybrid, and then what the staffing looks like in that particular building. So for instance, we have a middle school that at least one middle school that was able to keep those groups completely separate because they were big enough that and things broke out well enough that they could have basically a portion of their faculty that was all virtual and the others doing hybrid. But we weren't able to accomplish that at every single building, just based on numbers and availability of staff.
Okay. So right now we can assume that our virtual kids, 100% virtual kids, are getting synchronous learning with teachers.
I would say primarily. I wouldn't say that that's a 100% the case. But we could walk through. I can't do it right now, but I could walk through some examples of how that played out at different buildings to help the board more clearly understand the challenges behind that.
I know it would be helpful because I was very confused when that parent, because it's a smaller school, and I was surprised when that parent had approached me and said, just asked about that, because I was not under the mindset that we were going to, it felt like in that building anyway, that there was very much a possibility it could have been synchronous learning, but that's not how it turned out. So I was surprised with that.
Yeah, and if you would send me the school, I could get you a more detailed answer. And if there's something that we can, alter in that regard, we can certainly do that.
Okay, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
What other questions or conversation does the board have this evening?
So just to be clear on those numbers that Kelly was talking about, the kids who signed up for staying virtual have 80+% attendance, but the ones who are hybrid are kind of struggling to get there on their virtual days. Is that how I should read this?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think part of that is possibly a struggle to get there. Part of it may just be that we're not, we haven't figured out the right connections yet and made expectations clear and set out a concrete enough schedule. I think that's kind of a question. I mean, I think part of it is that there's I think a sort of natural feeling that I'm in, when I'm in school, physically, I'm in school. And now, since I'm not in school today, I get to kind of take the day off. So that's a mindset that we have to, work on correcting as well. But this is also a pretty limited data set because we've only been in this for about 2 weeks at elementary, and that was a pretty major transition for everybody, including our teachers. So I do expect this to pick up and improve over time as we get better at this.
And then just to piggyback on that, like our virtual, again, participation attendance could just be a student had a conversation with the teacher. So they may not have sat in their classes all day, but they could have had a conversation with the teacher, and that's counted as attendance.
Yeah, that could be the case.
I'm going to put on my teacher hat for just a second, Tom, and ask you, one of the things that I think I've been hearing from middle school teachers was the way that this was going to shake out in terms of their workload. And I also, got an email that, the first day is a little awkward because of, the social distancing that has to be respected and kind of all that. And I know these are early days on looking at this data. But what things and what supports are your team ongoingly providing, I guess? Because I know at the beginning of the year there was a lot of teacher professional development days around virtual learning and all of that. So what kind of supports do our teachers have as we're kind of talking about trying to figure this out, and what supports are they being given currently?
Well, I can't get real specific about that right now. I mean, we did a lot of professional development, but we, trying to prepare our team for something that none of us have ever experienced before certainly left us wanting in that area. So the biggest area of support right now, I mean, we've tried to be flexible on things like attendance. And some smaller things like that, just so there's not that constant pressure to get something checked off your list. The other is to continue to work in our PLCs to identify what the issues are, and then create more blanketed responses to some of those things that we're learning are getting in the way of our teachers doing their best work. But right now, we're pretty early in the early stages of that. So that's going to continue to be an area of focus.
Okay. I can just imagine that the amount of pressure that's on teachers right now to, have this figured out as we're looking at their data a few days later. Like I just wanted to raise that up, that I'm not looking at this, like we don't know yet what our data says, I guess is what I'm offering.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Especially at the middle school level. And I would also offer, I know that we've had this conversation, it was mentioned a couple times, so I want to raise it up again. But there was, a little bit of a mention, I think on your behalf and your team's behalf, that some things would be taken off of teachers' plates to better focus on kids, whether they were, virtual or in front of our teachers. So can you just kind of give us an update of those types of things, just so, and especially in ways that they might, be things that the board might be used to seeing or hearing about happening, or our community might be used to seeing or hearing happening?
I'm not sure I'm following the end of the question there, Kirsten.
Yeah, just especially in like the big overview things. Like I don't need to know like the tiny nitty gritty things, but I know that, we had mentioned that some things might be taken off teachers' plates. So, are there extra, supervision duties, or, what are some of the things that are kind of being taken off our teachers' plate that might impact the way that things normally happen in our schools, or the way that parents might see events happening in their schools, that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess that last statement is probably one of the biggest ones. We just aren't really having events in our schools because we're trying to keep traffic to an absolute bare minimum to limit, introducing any additional exposure in the buildings. As far as a blanket answer to that, I don't think there's a very good one. A lot of that is based on how building leaderships teams have approached that with their principal, and identifying, how can we pull in additional folks or repurpose some folks so that we can take away some supervision duties. That's one of the biggest, ways that we're trying to help teachers out so that we protect what limited planning time that they have. But in terms of like a district wide, we were doing this for everyone. Those are pretty small in number, but more will evolve, as we learn more about what the needs are and how we can creatively apply resources to address those needs.
Okay, and I'm not going to ask any further questions and get us further into the weeds on that one. But what I would just like to raise up is are often moments where we do things tight and loose for our kids in terms of curriculum to make sure that they're getting equity. And so I would just want to raise up that I'm hoping that as we're planning for our staff, that we're being mindful of what can we do at a district level to keep in mind equity so that those decisions aren't left up to, the building administrator that you have. So
Yep.
I don't have any further questions then. Do any of my board colleagues have anything further at this time? All right, if not, we had, I believe, do we have a motion from?
Martirano, and a
Thank
second
you.
by Bradley.
I knew the second was by Bradley. A motion by Martirano and a second by Bradley. If there's no further discussion, please call the roll call vote.
Mr. Barron,
Yes.
Miss Bradley,
Yes.
Mr. Cody,
Yes.
Miss Delagardelle,
Yes.
Miss Martirano,
Yes.
Miss Sawyer.
Yes.
All right, the vote is approved 6-0. The next item on our agenda is item D3, COVID-19 Learning Modality Metrics Update. This is a discussion only item for this evening. And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Ahart. Well, actually, do we have any speakers on this item? Let's do that first.
We do. Nicole Cable.
Good evening. I'm Nicole Cable. I'm the school nurse at Roosevelt, parent of 2 in the district. 1 7th grader, 1 10th grader. Both have been virtual, will stay virtual into term 2. Before I get going, I do want to express some appreciation about the fact that the district has brought on Dr. Schaefer as a consultant during this unprecedented public health time that's going to extend for quite a while. I'm glad to hear that we have brought in some expertise to assist with that. I have worked over the last several months really to be a source of information and confidence for our staff, for our building, for other nurses within the district as we work to figure out how we're going to respond to things. I appreciated Dr. Schaefer's comments last week when she responded, I believe it was to Mr. Cody's concerns about could we sustain in-person learning when we were outside of the metrics already. And the fact that if our mitigations measures held in the building, even though there was increasing community transmission, that we may be able to continue to make hybrid work. That being said, I would feel strongly right now that we're at a kind of a crossroads where we need to have some straight talk within the district about what is a rapid deterioration of conditions, both within Polk County and within the state as a whole. We have seen a doubling of things within Polk County within the last week alone. And all public health experts would agree, not just Dr. Schaefer, but nationally, Dr. Osterholm, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Gottlieb, many others, that we are on the cusp of exponential growth as we head into these cooler months, especially in the upper Midwest and in Iowa, but soon throughout the nation. As cases worsen that quickly, one of the things we run up against is that it becomes more and more difficult to hold the line on the mitigation measures. So going back to Dr. Schaefer's comments from last week about we can be okay if we can hold the mitigation measures in the building, as community transmission increases this exponentially, we will have more and more exposures within our schools and also outside of our schools. So people who didn't get COVID-19 from our schools, but who are nonetheless affected either as isolation or quarantine cases. The number of hours our staff will spend assisting affected individuals will grow significantly. All experts will tell you that contact tracing becomes more difficult, if not impossible, as cases increase both this dramatically and this quickly. Absences will impede both learning and teaching, so both for students and for staff. Just last week and this week, as I'm talking to affected individuals about quarantine, I am citing dates that are into the 3rd and the 4th week of November. So those are individuals who can't be in a building until well into the end of November. But if you said, what am I most worried about? I'm most worried about our staff. I feel like we see an increasing sense of nervousness and fear from our staff, given the worsening numbers. And I'm hard pressed increasingly to really project hope and confidence, given the dramatic worsening of cases in the state of Iowa. Even as I look at my own household, one of my own kids has significant anxiety related to COVID, had it at the start of the pandemic, and recently has started to express significant concern again about catching COVID when the child goes out to do routine activities. That would be volunteering at the food bank, or as I go out to do grocery shopping or go to work, or over the fact that the kids are going to come back into the high school setting just next week. I know that other staff likely have loved ones who are in a similar boat or feeling that anxious themselves. When we set the metrics at the end of December, we did it because we know it's hard to make difficult choices as things become increasingly more unpredictable. But I feel I'm increasingly concerned that we've pinned our hopes to moving into hybrid because we started virtually, and that we are going to hold to that even long past the time where it becomes prudent. As we move into term 2, it's clear that exponential growth is both being predicted and starting to happen already, and that mitigation measures may be more and more difficult to hold in a hybrid setting. So as we move forward, we really have to be asking ourselves, what are we doing to protect staff, students, and families? Staff are the backbone of our organization, not only today, but next year. And so we need very much to protect their safety and their trust and their confidence. Please don't ignore their concerns. We know that we can serve our students and our community while maintaining their safety if we do it in a virtual format. My greatest fear is that we will hold a hybrid long after we should. Please be very mindful of how quickly the conditions are changing. We cannot commit to term 2 just because we're trying to please the governor. Thank you.
Ms. Jenkins, any further speakers?
Yes, Jason Baker.
Good evening, board members and Dr. Ahart. During the past month, I've sent you all several emails, but only heard back from a few board members. I certainly hope that doesn't mean that tonight's discussion about our current COVID metrics doesn't mean that you already have a decision in your minds. Our current reality, based on the metrics you've set, is terrifying. Your concern for your own safety, shown by this meeting being held virtually, is simply egregious. Why aren't you willing to take the same risks you're telling the rest of us we have to take? Yes, I may only be a dispensable teacher, but my own children, 5 and 7 years old, also attend Des Moines Public Schools, and I hope you'll not think of them as dispensable too. We're all hoping you'll make the moral decision to move us back to virtual learning effective immediately. If you allow high school students to begin tomorrow, I believe our numbers will soon become volatile because they're in an even more vulnerable age range than elementary and middle school students are, just as the doctor told us last week. Is being in the physical building what's best? Absolutely. Is risking everyone's lives what's best? I hope you don't think so. Only one board member has been my ever-illuminating beacon of hope through all of this, and I ask that others from this board step up and make the right decision too. It may not be popular with everyone on this board, But I do know one thing. In reading through the oaths every single one of you took, being popular was not something that you agreed to. I'm going to illuminate you on the guidelines I teach my students on identifying a bully. A bully is someone who repeatedly seeks to intimidate those they perceive as vulnerable. Let me repeat that. A bully is someone who repeatedly seeks to intimidate those they perceive as vulnerable. That sounds exactly like Governor Reynolds in her stripping our local rights to make these decisions. But I will guarantee I'm part of a much larger audience who will go into the battlefield if necessary with you to deal with that bully. Because there's only one way to deal with a bully. It's gathering upstanders who refuse to allow the behavior to continue. Will this school board and all of Des Moines Public Schools be an upstander or simply a bystander? The choice is yours. Sincerely, Jason Lee Baker. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further speakers, Ms. Jenkins?
I do. I have a letter that I'm going to read on the behalf of Valerie Cohen.
Thank you.
It starts. Forgive me for sending this in an email, as I usually prefer to sign up and speak my truth to the board. However, as I presently am 24 plus days into COVID, I can't guarantee that I'm awake and at my best to do so, as I am entirely at COVID's mercy, and she has none. As such, I have spent the better part of almost 4 days writing this because I do not often have the stamina to concentrate and sit up for more than 5 minutes at a time. I say this not to garner pity. I say this all to remind you that while a number of you have jumped full throttle onto the face-to-face learning train, it's beyond time to pump the brakes. Pump the brakes and innovate. While public education has been tasked with everything from childcare to nutrition to education and infection control to perhaps compliance with a state-issued edict whose reckless madness Caligula would appreciate, COVID death is not only worrisome risk when we play with fire like face-to-face learning as an unmitigated raging pandemic. How many of our poorest families of students and staff can afford to be in my shoes? Heck, I haven't even been in my shoes for over 3 weeks because of COVID-related sores on my toes due to do better with my Sherpa slippers. When I make those occasional pilgrimages to Express Care or ER visit for urgent testing. You see, this isn't a flu. There's no reliable way to guess or pick and choose who will be asymptomatic versus who is practically chained to the bed for weeks on end, like I have been. While I presently have a reasonable bank of sick time amassed over 6+ years of working through colds and flus as American work culture and school bus staffing shortages demand, I am even scared that I could burn my sick bank to the ground, potentially before I withstand a whole day of work again. And then I'll be jobless and forced back to square one. I already know I will most likely be losing my district health insurance July 1st, and that's hard enough pill to swallow. While I have long said that operations staff has far more to offer in terms of intellect than the district is usually tapping, I'm going to double down and say now is the time. Pump the brakes and innovate. All hands, distance, and on deck. There's absolutely no way using just district buildings at the high school can be safely distanced while compliant to a 50% in-person learning inside our buildings, given that families have chosen hybrid at roughly double the number needed to approach CDC minimum distancing recommendations. I don't know where our lawsuit is in terms of potentially tackling this situation, but if we're going to be face-to-face, no reasonably responsible and educated follower of COVID science would advise it. Let's consider some opportunities to slow the flow of people into tightly packed into our buildings. Have we explored putting out an urgent request that businesses sponsor large pop-up tents that we can use on our properties for overflow classrooms? Yes, I'm serious, as a raised heart attack risks associated with a pandemic. Tents can be ventilated, tables and chairs can be regularly sprayed down like our bus interiors, and patio heaters could be utilized. Pull all our extra non-porous furnitures out of every nook and cranny. This could provide essential space and also put the students in our Wi-Fi range. Our district COVID team could put together quizzes to establish which staff have the capacity to help properly set up the protocols and supervise these on-site satellites. And with our governor's reduction of degrees and standards, we could literally seek staff volunteers to be paid for this work to take the eligibility quiz in almost anywhere in our staff pool. If you are incredulous about the potential use of circus tents, perhaps you aren't aware that the fact that field hospitals are already in use around the Midwest. They say desperate times call for desperate measures, and I think we've hit a desperate time a while ago, and many scarcely recognize it to be a speed bump. We could get all the excess furniture moved fast, utilizing not just our district trucks, but our wheelchair buses in their downtime. Our buses could literally be warming stations to augment tents. By now, I'm running out of my time in speaking time, but permit me to close out with a few important points that I will try to slate with the brevity. As a taxpayer, parent, staff member, now is the time to think outside the box. Indeed outside the buildings. I really and truly believe that we should remain virtual unless and until we actually can meet the already too relaxed metrics. But if we're absolutely not able to, per our lawyer's advice on the case of the potential local administration rights and whatnot, please put out the lifeboats, because death isn't the only danger with COVID. An essential piece of this will be that we have truly and fully reached our staff and students with the proper and complete masking being absolutely required, and what that means. We need to enforce it with vigor and enforce some of our staff policies, not because of what I saw before I got sick was not enough. From staff and even some managers, we need to make it absolutely clear and mandatory training, including no net gators and such. Our students can even make TikToks about it, and we can engage them and use the winning ones to push out virally. We should also make available to staff and potentially students high-quality, non-fogging large face shields and/or goggles at cost, with the express understanding that while the district would like to be able to cover the costs, it cannot. And therefore, it's at least providing the buying power and convenience, because we're all essential and valued. If you want to use the 1,500 plus pairs of shoes held by each pair Iowa's mobile COVID-19 emergency shoe memorial as a traveling education visuals around our district during the school days, I'd be happily help coordinate with our volunteers to make this happen, because it seems it's up to us to make the public aware that we can't simply wish this away, and it indeed is deadly serious. Since all I can really do is lie around these days thinking, had to share these thoughts. Sincerely, Valerie Cohen.
Thank you, Erin, for reading those remarks. Do we have any further speakers this evening?
We do not.
Okay. Dr. Ahart, just as a reminder to the board and to our public, this is a discussion. It's listed as a discussion only item, so I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation. You're muted, Dr. Ahart.
As I'm sure everyone is aware, the COVID conditions in Polk County and in Iowa are getting increasingly worse. It seems a very long time ago now to think back to March, when we were first all becoming aware of what would happen with this pandemic, and then to learn what little response, meaningful, coordinated response there's been at the state and federal level. We've tried to navigate that in a variety of creative ways, and we're now at a point where the metrics that the board set have been, at least the community spread metrics, have been far exceeded. We're well into the virtual. In fact, the cases per 100,000 is at 372, where we said that 100 would be where we move into fully virtual. Clearly, the state is of a different mind in terms of what is acceptable for fully virtual, and our hands are tied in that we cannot creatively meet the needs of the students who most need in-person instruction, because the only thing that counts is 50% in-person instruction for every student that hasn't self-selected fully virtual. So we've been handcuffed a bit. However, that does not change the facts that community spread is on fire, very much on fire, much worse than it's been in the past, and certainly it looks like that's the direction that we're headed. The metrics that we have, I think we need to decide if we're going to use them or not. Certainly people are paying attention, and while at this point in time we have fewer than 200 cases identified among district staff and students, we certainly expect that number to start climbing, not because of exposure that's happening within the schools necessarily, but because of exposure that's happening in the community that's becoming increasingly difficult to avoid, just because there's so much virus out there, and there are so few systemic mitigation efforts in play in the community. So what we do certainly will have an impact on the greater community. And while I agree with what Mr. Baker shared, that face-to-face is certainly our preferred modality, and to use the Senate language, our presumed modality. We don't want to be engaging in in-person instruction until we have a list of casualties, because we went too far for too long. So those are the comments that I'd like to share. As Ms. Delagardelle shared, there's not a recommendation tonight, so we're not asking for a vote, but I do think it's really important that the board understand, not that you're not all paying attention anyway, but that we do point up that we are in pretty tough shape, and we're expecting the conditions to only worsen as we move forward. We do have Dr. Megan Schaefer with us this evening, and I've asked her to provide a short presentation just to sort of reset where we are as a community, and then we can open it up for discussion. Dr. Schaefer.
Yes. Dr. Ahart, because you had mentioned again that I had said that there was no recommendation, I just wanted to give those who are listening at home kind of a reminder about how our process would work around this. The board has decided that our process is for our superintendent would make a recommendation on when the district-wide instructional modality may need to change. So while you've painted a pretty dire picture, there's no recommendation this evening. Do you have any idea for either the board or our public of when a recommendation might be made?
No, not at this time, but it's certainly, very, very present in my thinking. I spend significant amount of time, trying to figure out what's happening and paying very close attention to what's happening in our schools relative to COVID. It's been useful or informative to have the zip code data that Polk County is now producing, and if you look at that, you'll see that most of the district is in the yellow zone, in that 15% range. Not all of our zip codes are. One of the challenges with that, using that data, however, is that if you take the population served in any one of our schools, they're not the students that attend school at any of our schools are not limited to just one zip code. So we'll have students from multiple zip codes attending one school. So it's a little difficult to make, to draw clean lines and anticipate exactly what the risk is in a particular school just based on the zip code data, though it does help flesh out the picture in more detail, and perhaps Dr. Schaefer can share a little bit more about that. What I would what I really hope to be able to do is to ensure that we're not putting staff and students in any more harm's way than needed, and hopefully making a decision to close a school prior to a big outbreak where a lot of irreparable damage will have taken place before we've taken action.
Thank you, Dr. Hare. I have a few more questions related to that, but we'll let Dr. Schaefer do her presentation first.
Okay.
Okay, is it okay if I share my screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think a lot of this has already been addressed, but I'll try to make it brief and allow for any questions that you might have. So as far as Iowa's activity goes in the context of other states, we are back in the top 5 in the country in terms of cases per capita. So we've been in the top 10, probably 2 months now. We dropped to 10, I think a week or two ago, now have surged back up. The majority of our counties are in a red state, which is the highest level of spread that you can have. And as of just before this meeting, our statewide percent positivity for 14 days is actually 14.9 or 15%. It's 12.2 for Polk County. And quite honestly, that's a number that I didn't think that we would ever hit, but we have. And there are, I think, 55 counties that are at 15% or higher as far as consideration for district operations go. In terms of percent change, some of the things I like to point out with these graphics down here, the country as a whole is definitely experiencing a very significant surge, in part due to the onset of cold weather, changes in population behaviors as far as, lessening of restrictions. Yes, we do believe that schools are coming into play. I believe another speaker mentioned 61,000 new cases among children. The American Academy of Pediatrics tracks that, though I will say that is likely an underestimation, as we can't exactly pinpoint in all states exactly how many child cases are present. Another thing that's significant in terms of the severity of the severity of the surge is 101% change in the number of cases for Iowa. So no good news there. As far as Polk County activity, so I know this graphic might not look too sensational, and that's because I really have to abbreviate the picture just because there's so much data to look at now. But this surge, and I changed a couple of the takeaways here from the notes that you have present, the doubling is actually anticipated from the predictive models that I have to happen within the next 2 weeks. So by doubling, I mean the highest point that we had on the first peak was approximately 200 cases. Oh, sorry about that. So we're on track to hit that within the next 14 days, and then thereafter within 18 to 20 days could triple that number to an average of 600 new cases per day in Polk County. Now, I do want to caveat that, and that predictive modeling is very restrictive in terms of knowing when we actually hit a peak. So we can't necessarily anticipate a peak. We can just look at the trend, the trajectory that we're on, and the pace of change that we're seeing. Something that could actually help this would be honestly the weather. We're having a really warm week that could slow down some of this activity. It pushes people outside, pushes people away from each other, and that does help. Now, it doesn't set the stage for a great winter. It definitely shows what this virus will do when it gets cold, but that does give me somewhat a little bit of hope for the next couple of weeks. In terms of hospitalizations, though, we are approaching a very serious situation. I know UIHC has been in the news, but in terms of metro hospitalizations, they like to stay under 150. There are healthcare workers that are being impacted by the surge, and we're at 122 as of today. And again, that is more than we saw with the exception of the first wave. The highest we ever got to in the summer in any of our any of our peaks, I believe, was 98. Other metrics here, we are at 372, like Dr. Ahart said, for the last 7 days worth of cases per 100,000, and then we're at 12.2 as far as percent positivity. Some other things that I'm seeing in the data that are driving that percent positivity that were factors in the summer, but that don't appear to be now, is there may be increasing limitations on access to testing, which, though we really want a ton of testing as much as we can, it can drive up the true percent positivity and give us a more stable picture of what we're seeing. So I know that there's a reduction in the number of countywide test sites and a reduction in the number of hours that will occur at those test sites due to winter months and daylight savings. Some other metrics, and I've added some things in here just to give us some context about our neighboring districts. The neighboring districts are all reporting similar things to Des Moines Public. A little bit of variation here, but there's some things that I think are definitely worth tracking. As far as Ankeny goes, I believe Ankeny just decided to not pursue full in-person instruction for middle school and high school, in part due to community metrics. Their activity as far as schools go is not in a position that the other 3 large districts are in our area. So what we're seeing in Waukee is an increase in cases, and I'm seeing increases within the last week more than they have had in some cases the entirety of the school year with those 3 districts. I wouldn't say that they're sensational numbers, but they are significant numbers. So what we're seeing in Waukee is a situation where new cases in a given day, and then a fair number of students and or staff who have exposures mostly due to not wearing masks, and that would constitute close contact and would put those people into quarantine. West Des Moines had 9 new students and staff positive today, 41 now new contacts in quarantine or isolation. And then Johnston also had an unfortunate situation where they have 29 cases in the last week, more pending, and over 400, almost 450 students and staff in quarantine again, because there was not a prevalence of mask usage among those who were exposed to those cases. So the districts I'd say to watch are Waukee, West Des Moines, and Johnston. Urbandale is doing really well in their model. I realize that they're the smallest district on the list and they've been in hybrid for some time. They too are definitely hesitant to make any forward progress in terms of changing their learning modality, and have been able to keep those key components of limiting spread within their school system thus far. Here's the zip code data that Dr. Ahart mentioned. I like to watch this as well. I think one of the things that would be helpful, honestly, is to do sort of a week over week, and I can add that in future decks. But yes, we are seeing these change to yellow. I'm sure they'll change to orange and likely red in some of these zip code areas over the next week or two. In terms of exponential increase, yes, we saw a literal doubling of activity in a week. And that's the most significant activity that I've seen since the beginning of the pandemic. There's a couple of notes about school situational research, not a lot of strong information that was published from what I can see this last week. There are more and more studies that are talking about the prevalence of transmission among children and adults being similar, if not the same. Again, children may not having less severe disease and shorter transmission periods, but still able to spread the disease just as readily as adults. And this study was one, and it takes a while to get some of these things to actual publication. I usually only cite articles that have been through peer review, but this is an overnight retreat where a single student resulted in 116 additional cases. A couple of notes also, one about herd immunity that I think is important for the public and likely the board to review, not advocating for herd immunity, but at the same time emphasizing the importance of the vaccine, which is still probably not likely to be widely available till sometime next year. And then also I think worth mentioning is the impact of college student clusters and their ability to actually drive community spread that is starting to emerge in literature in multiple regions of the country. So any questions on these data?
Dr. Schaefer?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
The district, the data on the other districts.
Yes.
You said keeping an eye on those. Is that something that's publicly available?
It is.
Where it's just on each district's webpage?
Yeah, and I'd be happy to provide those to you. I calculated the cases per 100 students because then I think that's a good equalizer, since we have districts of different size. And those numbers are really small. I think you look at 30 cases in a week for a district that has, 10, 11,000 students. That's not a lot, but that can explode really quickly. So yes, all the metrics are on their sites. They do report things a little bit differently, but I think it's good to look at that retrospective week and then count those up and see how they compare to each other.
Dr. Schaefer, you had mentioned some of the college clusters and the impact on that. And to me, I'm not immediately making that connection because I haven't, read this article yet. Can you kind of give us like the 30,000 foot overview of how that impacts our students or the decisions we might need to make?
Mhm. I think there's two takeaways from that. When you have communities that have college campuses located within them, what we're seeing are clusters of infection that are promoting community spread and leading to community spread. So I think we actually saw that in Iowa, in Dubuque County, and Story County. Didn't necessarily see it in Warren County, but the areas for which definitely saw it in Johnson County. There were large universities. There's a real challenge in trying to get those students to adhere to community mitigation strategies so that they influence that activity. What could be dangerous with us potentially is students come home at Thanksgiving break, Christmas break, and that further facilitates spread. So I think it's a population just like watching, long-term care facilities or any other congregate groups that could contribute to this picture. So that's why I added it in.
Okay. And this is just kind of an interesting note on there. I happen to live in the 50311 zip code with Drake University's campus. And it's really interesting because the moment where you walk on campus, there are signs of, in all public areas, you need to be wearing masks. And my experience is that if I don't have mine on within, 100 yards of being on campus, even if there's no one else around me, if a student does see me still trying to put it on, they're like giving me these looks like, what are you doing, person coming in off the street? So I will say that, I do think we have some great community partners that are doing some good work. And I can't speak to what Grandview does just because they're not in walking distance of my home. But yeah, so hopefully our community partners are doing their part to ensure that their students are being as positive as possible. So that's an interesting thing there. And then I suppose I have board members and board colleagues, I'm sorry, with their hands up. So Ms. Martorano.
Thank you, Dr. Schaefer. I have a question regarding the previous slide, specifically regarding the school stats. You've indicated on the slide that it's from the week of 10/24 to 11/1, but when you spoke of it, you said those are new daily cases. Can you clarify the new student cases and new staff cases? Is that the current number of positive cases in the district rather than new cases per day?
Thank you for, asking for the clarification. So because each site reports a little bit different, what I tried to do is take the snapshot of the 24 through the 1st. So what data you see in this graphic here should have ended on the 1st. So that's what I pulled yesterday. None of the school sites had been updated, but some of them were updated today. A few of them were updated last night, but I left those counts out of these counts just because I didn't have those updates for every district, but I did have the picture for last week. So these were all the cases that are available on those websites for that period of time.
Thank you. And then I would just like to bring light to the zip code dashboard. It's helpful. However, I struggle a little bit from the standpoint of the way that the health department has chosen to break down each color. Each color is not an equal number of percentage points. For example, the green are only 1 or 2 percentage points, and then you get into the yellow and it's 6 percentage points and then 9 percentage points. So I just caution everyone as you're looking at this and you're looking at the color variation that you really pay attention to that key because it's not a great way when it comes to data integrity to display these colors when it's a different number of percentage points apart.
Related to that, this graph bothers me a lot too, because when you look at that and see all yellow, we're trained to think yellow is pretty decent. But yellow is bordering up on 15%, which is basically triple the rest of the civilized world, as we've been over a couple of times. But this graph is not saying things are going okay, or this map. This map is saying things are pretty terrible right now, except for the parts we've sliced it up.
Well, it's hard to say. It could be 10% or it could be 15%.
Either way, the recommendations have been 5 or 3 from the rest of the world.
And Dwana, did you have you and I were having a conversation, I think, related to this earlier today. Did you have some questions around this that you wanted to bring forward, since we're kind of on this discussion of how this zip code data can color our perceptions of what's happening?
Yeah, I have quite a few questions, but I'm gonna stick with the zip code right now. Looking at like the data here as I'm looking at it, just wondering about like, some of these, we're looking at Polk County as a whole. I guess for me, I'm more concerned about Des Moines proper and kind of where we're at, and wondering if like where we're seeing some of these yellow spaces, is there a correlation between that and maybe where we're seeing cases within our own buildings, within our district? Like, is what we're seeing here for zip code wise, is that lining up with what we're seeing as far as cases are concerned? Are we noticing for our district that we are having cases, I don't know, I'm just on the east side of town versus the west side of town? Like, how are we looking at things as our school district compared to how we're looking at this zip code data? I don't know if my question makes sense, but I'm just
Yeah,
trying to really dig deeper into our own district versus county versus state.
Yeah, Duana, right now that we don't have enough identified cases in our schools to say that one particular zip code is more problematic than another at this point in time. We're attempting to put those pieces together, but at this point in time, we don't have enough data to really suggest that there's a correlation.
And I'm making an assumption here. I know nothing about this, so Dr. Schaefer, excuse me when I ask this question, but I'm looking at, some of these places in Polk County that are very high, like 25% or 35% and higher. Does that have a direct impact in the way in which we're looking at positivity? Like for Polk County, I know we're saying that it's ticking up, but I'm assuming that some of these other cities are the reason why we're ticking up, when it seems like here, like in our area, it's not so bad, even though we know we're projecting it to get worse, but it seems like it's worse away from us, if that makes sense. And I'm assuming that is making these numbers look different, if I'm making sense in what I'm saying.
You are. I mean, I think this geographic representation of activity needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And I would never use this or recommend using this as a primary decision-making metric, because there are going to be a lot of issues with it. In part, if you have test sites or a lot of people who are proactive at pursuing testing, that can drive up your rates. But ironically, if you have a limited number of tests that are triaged to people who truly have illness, that can also drive up your test positivity. So, I think stepping back as you have as a whole and looking at the county activity, all of these zip codes are going to influence each other because we're all interconnected. They're all close together. The areas where we know we have pockets of outbreaks are not really reflected in the zip code data here. So we know we have some pockets of outbreaks, as I mentioned, in Johnston and Waukee. We know that we have outbreaks in, a couple of long-term care facilities, though probably not affecting community spread, but those might not necessarily show up here. Or they could also be students who live outside of the zip code for which their district would be in range. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, and the scale is also of note too. I would probably put 15% or higher at red, but we're in the situation we're in, so.
What other questions or discussion do my board colleagues have this evening? Ms. Bradley, I know you said you had some other questions.
Yeah, I do have some other questions. One being, when we're talking about, we know that this is flu season as well. So not only is it COVID, but we've got influenza A, influenza B, and then there's COVID. When people are getting tested, this is just out of curiosity, are people just getting automatically like marked as COVID, or are we distinctively identifying between influenza A, B, and COVID?
That's a great question. Actually, I think we're kind of in a clinical transition period. in that it's really early for flu. Now, granted, last year we had our first flu death in the state, I think the 4th of November. That is not the typical time when flu season would begin. What I'm seeing and hearing clinicians do is that COVID testing is still isolated from all other types of clinical respiratory virus testing. So the challenge that presents is that you have somebody who's sick with a respiratory virus, they probably have to go get their COVID test first, then they have to go somewhere else to get the respiratory virus testing they need for flu, for RSV, or for whatever virus they might carry that we can test for. I do think,
86% in Florida reported.
oh, sorry, I think somebody's off mute.
Mhm.
So that can definitely present a difficult picture. I do think, and this is just speculation at this point, but I do think that we're going to see more clinicians and more health systems move into a system where all respiratory symptomatic patients are tested in one area, so they can manage COVID and potentially even test for all of those respiratory pathogens at once. But I don't think they're quite there yet. To me, those are plans that'll probably be enacted closer to December when we start to actually see more flu.
Okay. And then I know we're saying that this is going to be worse. And just as you're following the data and you're looking at all of this, do we have a best guess of like how long we'll be in this spot? Do we predict that maybe in the next few months or so this ticks down? Like, I guess I'm just trying to get a gauge of, where does this go? I'm assuming we're in a worse, the numbers are worse now maybe than when this started. I'm making that assumption. I don't have the data back from when we first started this race, but just in your expert opinion, as you're looking at the trends, are we looking at this, going along with this for the long haul? I know people are saying COVID is going to be around for a while, so I'm not disputing that, but just as you're looking at the trends, what would be the picture here or the story as far as the time that we could be dealing with maybe this uptick, and at some point do we see it maybe ticking down?
Mm-hmm. It's a really tough question to answer. So the things that I look for are any lessening or slowing, any reduction in the rate of change. So if I start to see, something like right now, maybe a 3% increase every day, it starts to trickle to 2 or 1. So it becomes less severe of a curve. That starts to tell me that we're slowing down and we're approaching a peak. We're not seeing that yet. The other things that have happened so far, and I mean, again, we feels like we've been in this forever, but we don't have a whole lot of experience with how this surges and wanes, is that it takes 10 to 14 days to really implement or see a change. So if we think about like when we reopened, about 10 to 14 days after we started to reopen, we saw a surge in cases. When we started to see a surge in cases in August, we knew we had heightened college activity. It didn't really affect Polk quite as much as it did other neighboring counties. Then I'd say about a month ago, we started to see surging activity in Western Iowa. That's still happening, and now it's moved into our area. As far as continuation, I think we're going to be on this path for at least the next week or two. Like I said, the weather could have an effect, but it will take another 10 to 14 days from this warm weather burst for that to have an impact. So we might drop down, and then I can guarantee once it starts to get really cold, especially the bitter cold that we're all used to, that's when all respiratory viruses surge. And this clearly will too, as we've already seen in October.
Okay. And then Tom, this is my last question, I believe, looking at knowing that high school is starting next week, what will the typical hybrid day look like for high school? Is that going to look similar to what we've seen in middle school and elementary school? And then I'm sure high school is an area that we're really going to be watching. I know we don't have a lot of data on, cases and the impact that it's having, but I would imagine because we're talking about our older students, we're really going to keep a close eye on high school. So what's hybrid going to look like for them? Again, it's just as a reminder for me for next week.
Yeah, it'll look very similar to what it looks like in the middle school. If you remember, though, in anticipation of potentially moving between modalities, we did change the high school schedule this year. So a couple of years ago, we went from an A-B block where students had 4 classes on one day and different 4 classes the next day on an alternating basis. We changed to a modified 7-period block. This year, we're actually in a 4-by-4 block where students take the same 4 courses every day. And so a semester-long class is compressed into a quarter, and a year-long class is compressed into a semester. That simplified things and enabled us to ensure that as long as we didn't, with a few minor exceptions, I should say, in Central Campus because of the logistics there, students will be starting a new set of 4 classes, 3 or 4 classes. Some are only taking 3 on the 10th. And so they'll be, that makes it a little bit easier to coordinate the virtual and in person, and helps the students and teachers, frankly, stay more connected with the course, since they're only spending half the time with a group of students that they normally would if it were an A-B block. But besides that big schedule change, it will function largely like the middle schools does.
Okay.
So 2 days, 3 days in person, 1 week, 2 days in person the next week, with asynchronous during virtual learning.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's all the questions I had.
Other just questions or discussion from my board colleagues?
Yeah, so Dr. Schaefer, when we look at Des Moines compared to the neighboring districts, and we've got particularly cases per 100 is a lot lower. Is that, I mean, could a person assume that's just a function of our kids just not being in buildings yet when the other ones all are?
Yes, that would be my assumption.
So you would assume that would jump up to be at least comparable once the high school shows up? Well, 2 weeks after the high school shows up.
Yeah, well, it could. I mean, I mentioned, Urbandale's done a good job, I think, keeping things under control. Ankeny seems to be doing well also. The situations that I mentioned where I'm seeing new cases today that are more substantial than we've seen before in Waukee, West Des Moines, and Johnston are mainly situations where there's not widespread mask usage. So that's one of the key components of trying to prevent spread, is making sure those students are always wearing masks, distancing, contact tracing, testing, et cetera. So I'd say it's a possibility. It's really difficult to know until you actually get into that situation. But like I said, also, it's definitely worth watching these other districts, knowing what they're doing in terms of mitigation and seeing how this is moving forward.
Okay, and last week when you were with us, I think we were at 215 per 100,000 on that particular day.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the number. Now we're 372, I believe.
Right.
You projected that number was going to climb over the next few weeks until things, well, until who knows when. But I mean, is this growing at the rate you predicted, or is this more than you thought?
It's more than I thought.
Like substantially more?
It's double what we saw the last week. In past trends, it's been, it would take us maybe 30 to 40 days to hit a doubling amount. So this trend is definitely more significant than it has been before.
And yeah, and I think you said a few minutes ago, there's really no signs of it slowing down at the moment.
Not yet. And I watch a lot of our other states around us and just other states nationally to see if I'm seeing any type of peak. I'm not seeing anything yet.
Well, I mean, how high could this go? I mean, obviously with no limits, it could go infinitely, I suppose, but I mean, should we be shocked if it gets to 700, 1,000? Like we should be shocked right now, but I mean, I don't even know. What's an outrageous number?
Oh, that's a tough question to answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely empathize with you. This is more than I thought we would ever reach. And I'm definitely concerned that it isn't that cold yet, and we're approaching surge capacity for hospitals. So that's where I see some systemic risk as far as us being able to maintain our healthcare system.
Yeah, and actually, I saw a thing on, I don't know, Twitter or something the other day that had a timeline of when the state reached 300 or 400, 500 hospitalizations. And it went from a couple of months to a couple of weeks to a couple of days to get this last 150. Are those, what does the hospitalization mean in that? Is that like total people hospitalized at a moment or overall or what?
they're COVID-related hospitalizations. So there are 122 people in metro hospitals that are hospitalized for COVID-related conditions. 777 statewide. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Because yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard a couple of times tonight, we're approaching exponential growth, but I mean, these are two classic exponential curves that we're looking at in terms of cases per 100 and the hospital capacity. I think we're definitely there.
Yeah. Yeah. Hospitalizations, strangely, have been on a statistically significant increasing trend for longer than Polk County cases have. The other thing that I'm seeing with hospitalizations, I'm not seeing the rate of ICU admissions that we typically see, but I think that's coming. So that'll be yet another driver in terms of capacity.
Dr. Schaefer, in the weekly report that you prepare for Polk County Public Health, you'd noted that you thought that I think it said something along the lines of that the cases would triple in a little over 2 weeks, or activity is the word you used, and since I have you here, I wanted to better understand what that meant. It was activity will triple in the next 2+ weeks, triple the peak, I believe, the first peak. Can you clarify how I should read that?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I made a correction to that. And trying to manage multiple reports, I think it's more accurate to say doubling within 2, and then it would take a tripling within 18 to 20 days. So by tripling, what I mean is maximum number of cases on average a day, 200 and the first peak. So 400 would be the doubling that we would see within 14 days, and then 600 within 18 to 20. So thanks for asking for that clarification.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
I have some questions, both for Dr. Schaefer and Dr. Ahart. Dr. Schaefer, I have all sorts of curiosity questions that I might just email you later because I'm, kind of curious about this. But when we're looking at the rate of spread in our state, have you and others that are paying really close to these numbers, have we been able to kind of pinpoint what's behind this current rising trend? Like, is there action that could be taken within our community that could, and I'm kind of asking this outside of even the question of like, what do we do with schools, but just for our community, like what can we be doing or what's maybe changed in our community that could be driving these numbers?
Actually, we had this discussion within Polk County emergency operations call this morning. So what we saw in the first peak was really a concentration of spread around congregate settings. So we saw outbreaks in long-term care facilities, meatpacking plants, and a lot of cities that were socially dense. And we're not that, so it's taken time for communities to pick up that activity. So what we're seeing now, which again is not in published evidence, it's anecdotal, but I think it's still strongly anecdotal, is the lessening of restrictions and people growing tired of restrictions. The things that would help, a mask mandate. I mean, hands down, there's no question about that. There's no question about whether or not they work. The thing that I think people forget in their day-to-day lives is that 25% of these cases are asymptomatic. So you can still spread it, but if you wear the mask and other people are wearing the mask, it greatly reduces spread. So that's definitely perpetuating spread. We have reports of people going back to work symptomatic, childcare workers spreading it to other childcare workers, exposing 80+ kids in a childcare setting. Then they expose the parents, and it continues to perpetuate. So we're seeing that in small communities and metropolitan communities. The difficulty with this now is that it's so pervasive in the community that we have to have some kind of widespread mitigation strategy to make a difference. So we can't just isolate out long-term cares anymore, or meatpacking plants, or certain groups of people, because everybody's getting it. So I'm sorry, I know this is not like wonderful information, but there's just no other way that I can think to paint it.
Okay. So I guess I don't want to characterize your remarks, but the community spread is kind of beyond what we can do just in the role that we play in our community, that no matter what mitigations we're going to have, we're going to see this continue to spread in our community.
Right.
Okay. Okay. And that kind of answered that second half of that. And this was just a question about hospitalizations. You said that there were 122, I believe, as of today, or as of the last time you knew, hospitalizations in Polk County. Do we know kind of on average what the impact of people being brought in from other counties who maybe are full, of what that has on our overall Polk County capacity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, rural hospitals are doing a better job keeping their COVID patients. They're better able to manage. So there are not nearly as many transfers as there were before. That's still happening, but there's one metro hospital, I'm not going to name it, that's on diversion, so they can't accept transfers anymore. UIHC is not widely accepting transfers either. So that situation is one where there have to be surge plans enacted. And we don't want to be in a situation where we have to have a field hospital, and we're not in that situation. We're far from that situation, but we're on a very dangerous path. So yes, our hospitals are doing a great job trying to manage, but again, the more capacity you have, the more people you have, the more healthcare workers are at risk, the more risk you have for those people getting sick. So it's just not the position we want to be in.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to kind of switch gears just a little bit here. And Dr. Ahart, I had asked you previously, kind of when you thought you might have a recommendation for the board, and I want to kind of switch that a little bit of what is the process of when we might need to close a building, and does the zip code data provide any, coloring or, kind of narrative for you and your team as you are looking at that with who are the decision makers? I guess maybe we should just start there. What's that process look like? Because I know that was one thing that the board, that I'd kind of heard a little bit in our meeting last week from the board, was that there were board members who may be hesitant to want to close down an entire district, but would want us to pay really close to that building level data. Can you just walk us through what that process looks like?
Yeah, sure. So I do look at the zip code data. However, as I had tried to mention before, the students and certainly the staff working in any one of our buildings, even though the building itself is located within a zip code, the staff and students that attend and work in those schools are not exclusive to that zip code. So there's limited predictive value to the zip code positivity, except to say that if you remember the graphic from Dr. Schaefer's presentation, at this point in time, we have a pretty significant swath of the district that's all in that 10 to 15% range. So that's, somewhat helpful. Although Polk County itself is at 12.2, so, kind of in the middle. So far, we've not found the zip code data to be particularly helpful. At this point in time, the staff cases have really not been concentrated in a particular building or facility, and the cases the multiple cases that there are in some are not tied to exposure at the school. So it's that hasn't been particularly useful. And the number of student cases that we have also doesn't really point to a concentration in a particular building. So, we pay very close attention to that. And if we would see what appears to be a particular increase in a building, we would talk with building leadership and make sure that we have an accurate assessment of what's happening there, before we would move forward with a recommendation. However, I do want to call out, though, that my desire would be to act in a preventative mode, which has really got me on edge right now, because You may recall the metrics that I proposed that earlier in the summer, that after we saw what happened with the growth of the virus in our community, I know many people found those metrics laughable, but from a science perspective, they were not laughable at all. I think people recognized and still generally recognize that the metrics that the state has set out are not based in any science that we can identify. And the board, I know, went through an arduous process of trying to identify some metrics that would allow us to be in-person instruction with some modicum of safety. I'm highly uncomfortable with where we are right now. 372 cases over 7 days per 100,000 is certainly not a number that in April or May I would have predicted we ever would have reached. And I couldn't have fathomed having our schools open at that time with a case count this high. The positivity number, if you recall, when we had Dr. Osterholm here in the summer, if we had one metric to go by, and the state's only using one metric, it certainly would not be positivity for the same reasons that Dr. Schaefer mentioned. It can give us some clues as to what's happening, but it tells us probably more about testing, the amount of testing happening, than it does really about the virus. And in fact, I did ask Dr. Schaefer, and I've asked some folks from University of Iowa, how do we explain the pretty rapid growth, not just this past week, but for a few weeks now in the case rates without a commensurate increase in positivity, because that still doesn't intuitively connect in my head. But it all has to do with who's being tested and how many tests are being given. But like Dr. Schaefer said, there is so much virus right now in our community. And as Dr. Osterholm had shared with us earlier, we're on fire, and it's a forest fire, and the people are the trees. And as long as there's fuel and we're not taking collective steps to put the fire out, it's going to continue to spread. And so while I do think it's obviously important to know how much spread's happening in our schools, I have to say that once the spread starts to happen in the schools, it'll happen pretty rapidly. There's so much virus in the community, and especially our young ones can tend to be spreaders while remaining asymptomatic, that it's going to be really difficult with this much virus in our community to act quickly enough to prevent undue damage being done to the long-term health of our staff and students.
Kirsten, you're on mute.
Yep, I'm trying to get to the button. You had mentioned that while you wanted to be preventative as much as possible, who is it that you talk to, or what is that data that you and your team are looking at if you're going to close a building, I think was what my question was.
Well, frankly, I feel like we should probably be closing buildings now. I'm just waiting, on edge for the unspeakable to happen. And I know our staff and our students are really doing a remarkable job in maintaining the wearing of masks, and and our facilities and custodial and teaching staff are doing a great job of keeping up with all of the regular cleaning, and avoiding sharing spaces as much as possible. But congregate settings are the best way to spread the virus, and systematically putting people into the same space is inevitably going to lead to more spread, especially when there's this level of virus in the community. So I do, trust me, I do understand the situation that we've been put in because of our state policy, but it doesn't feel tenable to me at this point in time. So to speak to, certainly we would react if we saw saw an outbreak, but frankly, if we had the appetite as a team to do it right now, I would be pulling the trigger right now.
Okay. Ms. Martirano.
As you've been in buildings, Tom, and observing classrooms, I know that one of the questions I asked this week was regarding average class size. And in an effort to kind of focus on the things that we can control, do you believe that we are able to effectively, based on your observations, socially distance? You've said that the buildings and the students and the teachers are doing a good job of wearing their masks. Are we also able to, with that average class size during the hybrid days of 9 students, are our facilities providing ample space for that social distancing?
That's a really good question, and what I will say is we do a relatively good job of social distancing if we define social distancing at 6 feet. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. There's some variance, but by and large, we hit that pretty close, not exactly. One of the challenges in dealing with a new disease is what we know changes. And while 6 feet was recommended very early by the CDC, the most informed folks would say that really 12 feet is probably more reasonable. Are we close to 12 feet? No, not even close. Which makes, obviously mask wearing that much more important. But the other piece too is, we've been given additional limitations in how effectively we can quarantine. And that's a huge frustration of mine as well, because when we have, and this isn't as much the case at high school and middle school as it is at elementary, but when we have the same, when we have a group of students and a staff or a couple of staff members in the same space for an extended period of time, whatever is expelled, whatever aerosol is in that space, the longer those folks are in the same space, the greater the chances are of that aerosol making a connection with an uninfected person. So it does feel very much like a game of Russian roulette at this point. But yeah, the class sizes, we were fortunate to have the number of families choose fully virtual that we did, because that went a long way toward us getting close to that 6 feet social distancing, and that's pretty consistent.
Ms. Sawyer.
Thank you. Just really quick, we don't know, based on non-compliance where we've been so far this year, what our plan is going to be, or I don't recall seeing a plan of making up that time. And you just said that you would definitely recommend moving to a state of virtual at this time. And so I just want to clarify, so that your recommendation would be to be in non-compliance at this point in time. Would that be correct?
Well, what I'm trying to recognize is that we're in an impossible situation.
Okay.
I think that I think it's really if you look at virtually anywhere else in the country, save perhaps El Paso, Texas, I don't know that any other place is in as a compromised position in terms of local decision making and trying to be proactive to ensure that we're serving kids effectively and doing it in a way that is protecting the health and safety of staff and students as much as possible. And I want to remind everyone too, if we had all local decision making power, I'm not saying that all students would be virtual, but we would have, if we had the ability to prioritize and ensure that those that most need in-person instruction could be served in person, we could certainly be doing a lot more effective job of protecting both the staff and the students. But when you're forced into everyone who didn't self-select all virtual being in person at least 50% of the time, we're really compromising everything. We're compromising our ability to protect the health of everyone involved. And we're also, frankly, compromising the amount and quality of instruction, which is the other frustrating thing about having to make up time when it's difficult for anyone to make the argument that a 50% in person and 50% virtual equates to as much and as high a quality as we could in either one or the other. I think that's sort of a fool's errand. We're doing absolutely the best we can, but it's not in any way ideal.
So would we have the opportunity to go out to seek a waiver potentially after coming into compliance? I mean, we haven't really seen any other districts apply for waivers recently as far as I'm aware of, but I do know that there are other districts having these types of conversations or preparing to have these types of conversations. So there may be schools going out for potential waivers. Do you know?
Yeah, it's my
Do you have any sense of what that looks like?
Well, no, and that's we've made repeated inquiries, and I'll certainly do this again about what factors the state will consider with a waiver application. Now, we've made an application before, as have a couple of other districts that have been denied, and there's been no recognition of any factors except for the 15 to 20% positivity and 10% absenteeism specific to COVID. So, that's certainly a road that I'm considering going down again. But I'm not hopeful that if we've not at least reached the 15% positivity, that would be granted. But it's certainly something that we're considering talking with some other districts about, maybe a collective approach that maybe would hold a little more sway than just Des Moines flying solo.
Mr. Barron.
I just wanted to reiterate that last point that Tom made, which is that it's not just a matter of 15% positivity in the county, but we would still have to be at 10% absenteeism directly related to COVID. The number that we're reporting is not that number right now. That's not what we're tracking. It's not for that purpose, but we're a lot farther away, I believe, from meeting that metric than we are from the 15%. And to this question of being in compliance with the state, I find that a lower order concern of mine right now than I do the health of the people in the buildings and the learning needs of our kids. And we'll continue to operate from that perspective as we have these meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Barron. Mr. Cody?
First, I did go to the Department of Ed website just before this meeting, and 3 districts were granted waivers today. I've got Anamosa and North Tama, and then it looks like a private school in Marshalltown, or maybe Marshalltown. It wasn't super clear, but 3 of them came through today. But then my question is, that average class size, is that going to be remotely close to 9 in the high schools, or should we expect that number to be a lot bigger?
That's I just calculated that. If you hold on one moment, I can tell you pretty close to what it would be. Yeah, we don't, I can't really give you a very good estimate. It's probably going to be a little bit north of middle school. The scheduling, I did check on this a couple of days ago, and scheduling was still very much in process, so I can't really give you a good answer to that. But that's something that, at least by the end of the week, I can provide the board a pretty concrete number.
And I'm sure it depends on the class too. Some are always going to be bigger and some are going to be smaller based on algebra versus, I don't know, pottery or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know, gang. I'm just sitting here shaking my head about all these numbers as I have been for several weeks. Like, this is no surprise. But I will say that a few days ago, I started courting some firsthand accounts from people. Right now I'm in the process of scrubbing all their data so I can send it to you so you guys can see what they sent me. And it's a little bit disheartening. Like, we have procedures at elementary and middle school and pre-K, but what the people are telling me is a lot of that stuff is not occurring. I've heard from 2 different pre-K teachers or associates, I'm not sure which, who are now COVID positive because someone sent a symptomatic kid to school and thought, oh, I just gave it, one literally said, I just gave him a granola bar, he's good. The pre-K, universally, I've heard from several people that in a 3-hour chunk of time, 50 minutes of that, the kids are maskless because it's snack time and then lunchtime. One of my friends at middle school texted me to say, I've got a kid right now who's taking his mask, or well, either took it off or didn't have one, I'm not sure which, was running around coughing in people's faces. Now, whether or not he was infected or not, that's not the point. But then when she called for support, the office couldn't respond because the office was busy covering classes. Now, those of you that worked in or have been in the metro middle schools know that this has been a common issue. The office is overrun. If we're counting on them to be our mask enforcement, we're dipping into a dry well. Yeah, and like I said, I'll be sending this stuff out, but it's going to explode. Whatever we've got on paper, a lot of it is happening. A lot of it is, I'm sure, but a lot of it also isn't.
So I'm just trying to, I guess I'm just trying to think about the best way to use our time tonight, knowing that we can't make a decision tonight. We can't, Dr. Ahart can't make a recommendation right now. We can't make a motion. We can't vote on it because that's not the way it's listed tonight. So I guess, Dr. Ahart, it sounds like you may be ready to make a recommendation to the board and then allow the board to vote based on your recommendation soon. Do we want to discuss when you'd like to schedule that, or do we want to discuss that tomorrow at agenda planning? It just seems like we're to a point where you'd like to make a recommendation, and I think.
Yeah, I think if we could discuss that at agenda planning, that would be helpful.
Perfect. So
I'm sorry, can I make a clarification? If that's a recommendation, are you going to include in that whether or not you apply for a waiver first? And so just help me understand, we make a decision, we don't apply for a waiver, we apply for a waiver first and then a decision. If you can walk me through that, please.
I think Dr. Ahart would be able to make whatever the recommendation was. And if it was like that we should apply for a waiver, and then if we receive it, X happens. And if we don't, Y happens. I think that would be what he would be bringing forward to us. Just, the way he might a recommendation around, which cooler to purchase. I don't know. Like, those are pretty specifically outlined based on cost and other things. And I think the cost would be the waiver and the outcome would be the cooler, or, what happens with our educational mode. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Ahart, but that was how I imagined that this would work.
Well, yeah, I would like to be able to just speak to that right now, but I want to find out, I want to learn what I can learn from those districts that have applied, because as Rob said, we're a long way from one of the state's metrics. We're really close to another of the state's metrics. And I'm hard pressed to think that and I'm glad Mr. Cody checked on that, because I hadn't seen that yet, that if the 3 districts were granted a waiver, I find it hard to believe that they have 10% of their students absent due to COVID. But I want to check that. And I also want to see what it is that was included in their waiver that may have been given some weight that perhaps I failed to include in our previous waiver.
Okay. So we'll discuss next steps tomorrow at agenda planning, and I imagine you'll provide an update for the board on any potential future action.
For sure.
Okay. Do my board colleagues have any further discussions or questions this evening?
Mask up, folks.
We did hear that from Dr. Schaefer, so.
Please.
Since this is a discussion only item, I'm just going to move the board along to our information only items. I just want to point out to both the board and our public that we have a draft SRO proposal and some supplemental information there for review. Dr. Ahart or Mr. Troja, do we have any updates on when we might want to act, or do we have a timeline around that, or is that included in the information and I missed it?
No, we actually met about that today or yesterday, I don't remember. Yeah, what I would really appreciate is if the board, this is a long document, and you'll be able to see the stuff that's most pertinent, but it may be helpful to read all of it. But what we would hope to do, and we wouldn't have to act on it, excuse me, we wouldn't have to act on it on the 17th. But we would certainly, if the board's not comfortable acting on the 17th, we would want to do it on the first meeting in December. But what we're going to propose is not the old SRO contract, but a modified contract to bridge us from the end of November, beginning of December through April, and we'll present at our next meeting the process that's already underway, but the further steps in the process that we're going through to engage our community in coming up with a new version of what SROs would be in Des Moines schools, with the hopes that we would initiate that in April, and that would be the plan moving forward. We don't feel like there's enough time to get to our desired state and make it through, a good chunk of this year. So what we would hope to do is have a modified version of what we had been doing that kind of bridges the gap between the old practice and our desired new state that we hope to initiate in April. So we'll flesh that out in much more detail in November, but in the meantime, it would be helpful preparatory work for the board to look over the document that is included as an information item tonight. And Jake, do you have anything that you want to highlight in that? I'll take that as a no. I must have covered the bases.
Yeah, no, sorry, Tom. I was just trying to get to the mute button, but no, I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jake.
Okay. Well, the next item on our agenda is items of privilege. And when I kind of drafted out my remarks, I was not anticipating the meeting going this long, because my first note was to remind everyone, I believe we have polls open not for very much longer here. One more hour. So if you're in line at 9 o'clock, make sure you stay in line. And I also just wanted to, we did not get a chance to address this at the beginning of the meeting, so I wanted to address it now. Today was a day that we've been scheduled on our calendar for our buildings to be closed due to the election, so that they could be polling locations, but more importantly, so that our staff could have ample time to vote, to work at polling locations, to do some volunteering today, and to spend that time encouraging their friends and family to engage in that highest thing that we all get to do. And then just as a personal note, as I've been listening to this, and I've been thinking about the emails I've been getting from teachers and from parents, this is just kind of a reflection, and I'm just going to go out on a limb here to try to pull together some thoughts as they've been kind of coming together this evening. But as a board member, we kind of have sort of a a singular focus that has multifaceted responsibilities. And our singular focus is the educational outcomes for our community's kids. And that's sort of our singular focus, but that responsibility has lots of different facets. We owe responsibility as board members to our governing policies, to our community, and that thin line of local control that we're sort of feel like we're granted these days. To our Constitution, to our staff, to our parents, to our students, and especially our students' futures. And I have found myself during the last few months, as I know my board colleagues have, because I've had similar conversations along this vein with each of you, of how do we weigh each of those responsibilities in how we're making decisions today. And I think that the one thing is that I've found is as we've gone through this process, and even from day to day and week to week, that my priorities around which of those I weigh the highest, has shifted and changed. And so I guess this is just, I want to continue to thank our community for the emails that we're receiving. I appreciate it when I get the notes that you recognize how much time this has taken. And I know from my board colleagues and myself, this work that we do is a labor of love, out of love for our community, for our schools, for our kids, for civic responsibility. I feel like I can kind of, wax a little poetic on election day about our civic responsibilities. But for me, that fundamental pillar comes back to service. And, we stand on the shoulders of giants of both, board members that have sat at this table with us before, as well as civic leaders that have come before and allowed this. And I never take for granted the incredibly diverse perspectives that sit on this board and the way that each of my board colleagues challenge my thinking. And in a lot of ways, I'm very cognizant that we might be one of the most diverse elected bodies in our state. I think we probably are, if you would look at that. And I take that incredibly seriously. And I know that, the last tough vote we take isn't the last tough vote, and the next tough vote isn't our last tough vote. But this was just kind of my opportunity on election day to reflect a little bit on this responsibility that I don't think any of us thought was going to be in our hands when we first put forward, those 20 signatures, I think that we had to have to get on the ballot to, I think that's the minimum 50. It might be 50. The minimum might be 50. But either way, that doesn't seem like enough of my community members to need to talk to for how large this responsibility has been. And I'm incredibly grateful for the support that I've gotten from each of you and from our community. And even when I don't agree with the emails that I get, I'm reading them. I apologize. I can't respond to every single one of them. I'm a teacher myself. I'm teaching, full time with kids every day in my room, and trying to keep up with all of that entails in addition to this role. So I do read those messages, but I don't get a chance to respond to every single one of them. And I wish that I had more hours in the day to do that. So thank you again to my board colleagues and our community for the attention that you're paying to this and every decision that we make. So do any of my board colleagues have comments? I see Kelly has her hand up. Go ahead, Ms. Sawyer.
Yes, thank you. So maybe it's appropriate that I'm, sharing this announcement, excuse me, on election day, but just a reminder to our community that on November 21st, we will host our first legislative coffee. And just go to the DMPS Community Legislative Action Team Facebook page to register and get the Zoom link. We are going to offer that event via Zoom, but this is an opportunity to engage with our legislators, our elected officials in the Polk County area. And Tom shared with us our legislative priorities. So we are certainly going to be rolling those out, talking to legislators about our issues, as well as we will have a presentation by Shashank, who will talk about budget. So I would encourage you all, if you can, join us. Go to the Facebook page. You'll find the event information to register and receive the link to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sawyer. Do any of my other board colleagues have any comments to share this evening before I turn it over to Dr. Ahart for his report? All right, thank you. Dr. Ahart, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I did what I always do in the fall and remind our incredible staff to model civic engagement by voting. I'm confident that we had, on the DMPS team anyway, very high voter turnout. If it's not evident how important the role of public education is in creating an educated, informed citizenry so that we can have a successful democracy, I don't know what other evidence we need. Public schools have always played a vital role in our community and across the nation, and the election is always an opportunity to actively engage with that, and it's really important that we model that for our young people. This has been the year 2020 has been wrought with huge social challenges, and our elected leaders, to a large extent, determine how we make it through those. If every elected body took their role as seriously as this elected body does, we would have a very different state and a very different world right now, I would argue. We are in an impossible circumstance right now. I have no question about the dedication of the team of almost 5,000 employees that we have in striving to serve our students and their families absolutely as effectively as possible, while ensuring that we protect them against the worst pandemic in 10 generations. We're not through this yet, and the state's not through this yet, and we have a long way to go. I want to just thank the board for their leadership and thank our staff for their incredible flexibility and persistence and tenacity, patience and care that they're modeling for our students as we all try to make it through this really, I hate to say it, but this unprecedented time. And hopefully the only time like this that we'll all have to endure in our lifetimes. And if you've not voted yet, there's still time. Please do it.
I think you have 54 minutes based on my clock to get to your polls. And once you're in line, don't let anybody push you out of line. So without any business in front of us, I will go ahead and adjourn our meeting for this evening. Thank you, board colleagues. Thank you to our community and to our staff for being here this evening.
Thanks,